Hey guys, so in the last lesson, we looked at the various Flexbox properties that determine the layout of our items in a Flexbox container. We looked at the things that we can change about the Flex items and the things that we can change about the Flex container. In this lesson, we're going to talk about how to size the items in a Flexbox container, shrinking and growing, and how it should behave when it's in a responsive situation. Let's say we had a web page with 4 paragraph elements. So we know that paragraph elements are going to be full width because they are all block elements and they have a default amount of sort of margin and also padding. If we go ahead and put all of those paragraph elements into a Flexbox container, even if that container is invisible, it's going to turn each of these paragraph elements into Flex items. And by default, as you might remember, the main axis is along a row, and we can of course change that, but it stacks each of these items based on the size of their content, one next to each other without any gaps between. At this stage, even without writing any sizing properties, this has a default behavior where if we go ahead and change the width of our window or our viewport, if this is shrunken, then you'll see these blocks shrink in response. And Flexbox does most of this automatically, having a behavior that in most cases is what we would want, but sometimes you're going to need to customize this. And to be able to customize how each of the items inside a Flexbox is sized, we're going to need to learn a little bit about how it actually gets worked out and what is the algorithm essentially that Flexbox uses to determine each of the Flex items' size. And the way that it works it out is basically a priority list. The first thing it looks at is whether if there is a minimum width and a maximum width that's set on the item. If this is not set, then it's going to look at the next thing, which is there a flex basis set? And previously we looked at this property, flex basis, as a way to set the width on a row-based Flexbox or the height on a column-based Flexbox. Essentially, whichever direction is the main axis, the size is going to follow that axis. If there's no flex basis set either, it's going to look at the width, or in the case of a column-based Flexbox, it's going to look at the height property. And we've already previously set the height property and the width property, and you can set that on any HTML element, so there's nothing new there. Now, the final one that looks at if none of those are set is the actual content width. Let's say you had an item that contained a paragraph with the word app brewery. The content width, the ideal width, is basically the width that allows that text to be lined up next to each other. If the flexible box had to shrink, then it will go down to the minimum size, which is where the text wraps and they are stacked one on top of each other. This is now pretty much the minimum content width. So I'm going to show you an example of all 4 ways of setting the sizing, and we'll see with real examples of how this actually works in code format. Let's first create a Flex container that is just set to display Flex, has a gap of 10 pixels. Inside this Flex container, I've got 4 items, and each of those are paragraph items, similar to what we saw before. Each of these paragraph items obviously contain text that have different lengths. If we go ahead and just by default put these items inside a Flex container, such as here, then when we go ahead and shrink the size of this window, then what's going to happen is each of these items are going to automatically shrink until they reach the minimum content size. Notice that this box is the largest And that's because the longest word in that entire line of text is this word, programming. So that determines the minimum width of this box because it doesn't want to put words onto different lines. So it's going to set this as the minimum width that it will shrink down to. When this is sort of in real life, let's go ahead and animate it. This is what you'll actually see. It's going to shrink and shrink and shrink until it's reached that minimum width for the content. And then you'll see afterwards, all of that content gets pushed off the page and it will not be visible on screen anymore. This is the default behavior of Flexbox without us setting any of the sizing properties. And as I mentioned, by default, the max width looks at the longest possible line of the text, and the minimum width looks at the longest word to determine the minimum width. Now let's take a look at what happens if we decide to set manually the width of each of the items. Notice here that the Flex container still has the same code as before. It has a gap of 10 pixels. It's set to display flex. But now for each of these green items, we've now targeted them inside our CSS, and we've decided that we want each of them to have a width of 100 pixels. And that's exactly what you see here. Each of these have the same size and they are all 100 pixels wide. So now when the container gets shrunk, what happens is it's going to try and respect that width until there is not enough overall width of the container. So if we had 4 items which are 100 pixels each, then this container has to be 400 pixels, right? If this width becomes less than 400 pixels, then it's going to continue using the same algorithm to shrink each of the items. Now, again, notice that the shrinking is not uniform. It's still trying to conform to that minimum size of the content. So that even though the text goes onto different lines, the longest word is still kept intact. When there is enough space, it's going to respect this width, but as soon as there's not enough space in the container to accommodate all of the items that have the set width, it's going to ignore this and dynamically shrink each of the items until it reaches that minimum width for each item. Whereas initially, if we had nothing set on the items, it's going to look at the length of the entire line when it's all on one line. So that is going to be the content width. If, however, you have a width property set, then it's going to look at that instead of the content width. So instead of everything being all on one line, it's going to look at, well, what is the width that you've set? So if we said it's going to be 100 pixels, then it's going to try and make it 100 pixels wide until you have shrunken the container where it can no longer fit everything as 100 pixels. Then it starts shrinking the box. Now, the next thing that we can try adding is the flex basis. Notice how I've got a width set, but I've also got a flex basis set. And because I've got a row-based flex container, because I haven't changed it to column, remember we said the flex basis is effectively determining the width of each of the items. What does this look like then? Well, when you actually run this code, you're going to see that it's going to completely ignore this width because you have a flex basis set. And it's going to set each of the items to that flex basis, which in this case is 200 pixels. And you can see it's a little bit wider than the previous example. However, this again is in the situation where the container has plenty of space to fill. Even though you've got 200 pixels for each item, there's still space left. But if you shrink everything down where there's no more space and there's not enough space to give each item 200 pixels, then exactly the same thing happens. It's going to look at that minimum width again. And it works pretty much the same as it did with width. When we animate this, you'll see that it will give it 200 pixels if it can, and if it can't, then it's going to shrink it to the minimum width. So remember that when we have a flex basis, it will completely ignore the width. So there's actually not even any point in setting it because it's going to be looking at the more important property, which is the flex basis in this case. We've seen how we've gone from the content width, which is the default, to a set width, to a flex basis. And now we're going to see what happens with the minimum width and the maximum width. As I mentioned, there is a default max width and min width that's set based on the content. So the maximum width is all of the content lined up, occupying the ideal state, which in the form of text is to have everything on one line. And the minimum width is determined by the longest word, and it's going to be the width of that word at the font size that's set. You can also manually set each of these properties and completely ignore the content. And in some cases, that might be useful. Let's say that we had a flex basis of 200 pixels set on each of these items, but we go ahead and also set a maximum width of 100 pixels. Notice that in this case, 100 pixels is less than 200 pixels. So the flex basis is actually larger than the maximum width. So what happens? Well, instead of respecting the flex basis, which is 200 pixels, even when there's plenty of space, it's going to look at that max width and it's only going to give each item 100 pixels. So this max width determines how much the maximum width that the item is allowed to grow to. Even if you give it all the space in the world, how wide can it possibly be? Well, it's going to look at the max width. And if that max width is smaller than the flex basis, then it's going to take this value. But if the flex basis was smaller than the max width, for example, if we had a flex basis, instead of 200, it was, 50 pixels. Well, then in that case, each of these items will actually be 50 pixels instead. The maximum width is the maximum possible. It's going to try and respect the flex basis unless the max width happens to be smaller. And if we take a look at this in animation, you'll see that as I shrink this container, each of the items shrink. And as I grow the container, each of the items grow in size, but only up until that maximum width. The max width determines the growth potential of each of the items. On the other hand, there is the minimum width. As I said, the maximum width determines how big each of the items can grow to, and the minimum width determines how small each of the items can shrink to. Now, let's go back to that situation where we have a flex basis of 200 pixels. But in addition, we set the minimum width to 300 pixels. So notice in this case, 300 pixels is bigger than 200 pixels. What's going to happen when our website gets rendered? Well, it's going to look like this. This is 200 pixels, and this is 300 pixels. As you'll notice, it's actually respecting the minimum width, even though we have a flex basis that's set. When the minimum width is larger than the flex basis, it's going to respect that minimum width. But in addition, when we try to shrink our container down, it's only going to shrink until the minimum width is reached. So if your minimum width is very large, then it's not going to shrink beyond this size. So I've talked a little bit about growing and shrinking, and this is a really important concept to understand in Flexbox, because a lot of that flexibility, the flexible part of the flexible box, comes from this ability to grow and to shrink. It's probably easier to understand these properties by switching both of them off first. So we can switch each of these property off by setting it to 0. So let's set flex grow to 0 and flex shrink to 0 and see what happens to our boxes. They start out being 100 pixels wide, And then when we go ahead and try to grow and shrink it, namely trying to increase and decrease the width of the window, you can see that our items don't actually change in their size at all. They just stay exactly the same size as before because it can't grow and it can't shrink. So this doesn't even look like a Flexbox anymore, right? Let's go ahead and switch some of those things on. If we go ahead and change the Flex Grow to 1, which means that Flex Grow is on, but Flex Shrink is off, then what's going to happen is each of these items will first start out at 100 pixels. Remember, the Flex basis is the initial starting value. It tries to be 100 pixels wide. But then, because it's allowed to grow and there is plenty of space to grow, there's way more than 400 pixels to fit our 4 items, then it's going to increase the width of each of these items until the entire width of the container is filled up by each of our items. So when we adjust the width of our container, this is where you can see that when the width is reduced, it gets reduced to that Flex Shrink amount, which is 100 pixels. But it doesn't go any further than that. Any further than that, the items start going off the screen. But when there's more than 100 pixels, for example, when we're widening the amount of space, like here, it will continue to grow until it can fill up all of the space. Now, what if we switch that around? Let's turn off Flex Grow and turn on Flex Shrink. What happens here is by default, it is going to set everything to the Flex basis, so 100 pixels, and it's not going to grow to fill the space, but it is going to shrink beyond the Flex basis size until you reach that minimum width. And because that's not set in this case, then it's just going to look at the minimum width of the content. So this is actually the default setting of Flexbox items. It's going to not grow, but it is going to shrink. Even if you didn't set these 2 properties, you would see this behavior by default. Now, the next example I've got is where Flex Grow and Flex Shrink are both on. And as you can imagine, what's going to happen is it's going to try and take up as much width as possible. And then when you shrink it, it's going to try and be as small as possible. So in this case, the Flex basis is pretty much completely ignored because Flex Grow and Flex Shrink are both on. It's actually going to grow to the max width, and it's going to shrink to the minimum width. And if these 2 are not set, then it's going to infer that from the content of those items. Now, the default for Flex basis is actually auto. And auto is a little bit of a complex one because it's going to look at the amount of content in each of the items. So it's going to give more Flex basis to the items with more content. For example, this last item with the most words. And it's going to give less width to the ones that have smaller content. If you don't want that, and instead you want everything to be equal width, then you simply switch it off by giving it a 0. There's actually a shorthand way of writing this without having to write out Flex basis, Flex Grow, Flex Shrink. And we've seen this style of shorthand before in CSS. The first value is the grow. The second value is the shrink. And the third value is the basis. So it's exactly the same, but it's obviously a lot quicker to write. And because this particular set is so commonly used, you can actually shorten this even further by simply just writing Flex 1. And that means a grow of 1, a shrink of 1, and a basis of 0 to keep everything equal. We've actually seen this before where we created containers with different size ratios. A red item that is half the size of the blue container, which has a flex of 2. And the blue one is 2/3 the size of the one with a flex of 3. And essentially what we're doing here is we're setting the grow to 1 and the shrink to 1. And in this case, it's a grow of 2 and a shrink of 2. In this way, we're able to set a ratio for how our elements will respond responsively. So no matter if you grow or shrink, it's going to try and keep these ratios, and it's going to try and respect that even while it's being responsibly resized. That was quite a lot of information on how Flexbox sizing works. Let's go ahead and try an exercise to see if you can apply this in code and see if you've understood a lot of the principles that we talked about in this lesson. So head over to this URL where I've prepared an exercise for you. You can simply just write your code inside this text box, and then when you click Apply CSS, the goal is that your CSS rules will allow this blue Flexbox to behave the same way as this green one. So I want you to resize the window and see how the green box behaves. Does it grow? Does it shrink? What's the size that it wants to be? And I want you to use what you see on screen. So notice how I've told you what each of these should be in terms of their ideal width. And I want you to write your code down here, whatever it is that you need. Maybe you don't need to write any code under some of the brackets. Maybe you need to write more code. But essentially, once you click Apply CSS, the blue boxes, which you control with your code, should have the same behavior as the green ones. Pause the video now, head over here, and give that exercise a go. All right, so the first thing that you might notice is something that's actually completely unrelated to sizing, which is the fact that each of our items are distributed along this container. And that, if you remember from a previous lesson, so a little bit of revision here, is done using justify content. And this particular style of justify content is actually space between. So if I click Apply CSS, you can see it's now spaced between. Now, the next thing we need to change is the fact that each of these items actually should have different ideal widths. And we know we can set that by using the flex basis. Let's go ahead and set the flex basis for each of our items based on those widths. So it's 200 pixels for the item 1, 200 pixels for item 2, and 400 pixels for item 3. Let's apply our CSS, and you can see they're now equal width. And it looks like everything's the same. We've achieved our goal. But remember I said you have to resize things, and notice how they don't behave the same at all. Now, when we resize this, you'll notice that item 1 actually shrinks in our green flex box, but item 2 and 3 don't shrink at all. So we can tell that 2 and 3 probably have shrink disabled, and item 1 is left to shrink. Now, by default, I mentioned that all items in a flex box are allowed to shrink, and you can see our blue 1, 2, and 3 all in fact do that, shrink to fit the space. Now, that is probably a more useful behavior in reality, but in this case, because we're trying to do an exercise, let's go ahead and match it. So let's turn the flex shrink off on item 2 by setting it to 0. And let's do the same for item 3. Let's apply our CSS and see it now behaves exactly the same. So that is the solution to this simple exercise. But even though it's simple, it's actually quite difficult to work out exactly what needs to be changed. And hopefully through doing this exercise, you've had to review some content from before, such as justify content, and also you've had to think hard about how flex shrink, flex basis, and all of these different things we learned in today's lesson actually works. Have a play around with the code, try writing some stuff yourself, and once you're ready, go ahead to the next lesson where we have our final section project.